The Assiniboine are an indigenous nation that was separated from the Yanktonai Nation, which was also known as Stone Sioux or Nakota in the 16th centuries. The Assiniboine Nation prefers to be called Nakota, which means the Allies. They are also related to Dakotas, Lakotas, and Stoney's Nakotas Indigenous Nation. They're all the First Nation who collectively have gradually separated over time. The Nakota Nation is located in both Canada and United States. In Canada, they traditionally lived in the plains. From a homeland around the Mississippi headwaters, they moved northwestwards to the Lac of Woods and towards Lake Winnipeg. They controlled the vast territories of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where the majority of contemporary communities are still located. They also have mixed communities in Alberta. At the peak of their power, their territory ranged from Saskatchewan and the Assiniboine River valleys in Canada to the region north of Milk and Missouri rivers in the United States. The Assiniboine people were still separated in 8 different tribes, each with their own territories that would later become reserves. Each of these groups had their own governments, laws, policies, and services. They sometimes lived among the Cree, Saulteaux, also known as Ojibwe, Nakota, and Blackfoot Indigenous Nation. They still consider themselves a culturally distinct nation. The Assiniboine are closely related to other Siouan-speaking groups like the Dakota, Lakota, and Stoney Nakota. Linguistically, they belong to a Siouan family speaking a dialect called Nakota. This dialect was also part of Tunaxa and Sesquippensing language family and contains in part 2 languages, Stoney and Assiniboine. The Nakota Nation from Canada usually spoke the Stoney dialect, while the one from United States spoke the Assiniboine dialect. Both dialects are similar but have their differences. The Nakota people are often compared them to Spanish and Italian. Despite their similarities, still Nakota people lived in forests and parkland. They usually hunted the big game, deer, elk, and moose. They also caught smaller animals for their flesh as much as their skin. They gathered wild vegetables according to location and season, which included picking Saskatoon berries and other fruits to mix with dried meat, fish, and bannock. They are known for their expertise in constructing buffalo pounds, padlock used to trap and kill buffalo. They were also recognized for their constructing in travois, which were pulled by dogs and were loaded with teepee poles, hides, and personal items. They were used during the seasonal hunting with the Assiniboine Nation moved from place to place. Women wore long dresses made of mountain goat skin or deer skin.
Men's clothes were made of breechcloths with leather leggings and plains or plateau-styled shirts.
They all wore moccasin and long buffalo hides robes in winter. Nakota people usually wore their hair long and loose. Men usually braid their hair during war or cut them one morning. Men and women painted their face on special occasion. They used different patterns for wall paint, religious ceremonies, and festive decoration. However, only men had their chest and arm tattooed with tribal tattoos. Women had spirit line tattooed on their faces. Assiniboine people lived in a patriarchal family. Their mother's side of the family is important, but everyone believes that children belong on their father's side. However, the Nakota people have a big family unit that doesn't stop to the mother, father, and siblings. Everyone is considered family, and there's no such thing as auntie, uncle, or in-laws. Aunties are called Inana, which means my other mother, and uncles are called Adede, my other father. In those families, the children are raised by every member of the family, not only the father and the mother. Thereby, as soon as there is a marriage, the in-laws directly become part of the family and are treated as such. The Assiniboine children went to school and helped around the house. Many of the Nakota children also liked to go hunting and fishing with their father. They had less time to play in their daily lives, but just like normal kids, they had dolls, toys, and games to play with each other. First Nation young kids, Nakota, were carried around by their mother in a custom-made cradle board, which was later adopted by the dominant society. In the daily political and social lives of the Nakota people, only men could occupy positions of leadership and were the only one who took the most important decisions. The community chef was elected because he was a good man, choosing to deal with outsiders, but his actions were guided by a council. In each tribe, there were several extended families. Each family had the duty of electing a counselor who was to represent them at the meeting. The chef of the family, and sometimes even the chef of the community, were elected for their leadership. For example, they could be elected for their superior hunting skills, their achievement on battlefields, or even for their kindness and generosity towards the others. Women and men all participate in council meeting. The Nakota people listened particularly to the family members who were known for their wisdom and talent. Thus, the elders, the shamans, the women, and the heads of families were often the ones who talked. The Nakota people also elected leaders for a short amount of time. These leaders were thus elected for special function and purposes, such as war chief to lead the battle or hunting chief for a large scale of buffalo. The Assiniboine First Nation believed in self-realization and the realization of the others. Men and women used prayers, songs, drumming, dancing, and fasting to honor the Great Spirit. However, only young men will go on a vision quest to sacred grounds to communicate with their guardian. The most sacred ceremony of the Assiniboine population is the sun dance. It is done in early summer or after the spring bison hunt.
The Assiniboine Nation first came in contact with Europeans in the 17th century. Around the time of European contact, the Assiniboine people, also known as the Nakotas, controlled vast territories in the plains, which were parts of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. They were also participating in the buffalo hunt and the fur trade. Hunting was a method used by which Plains and Métis peoples obtained their main food resource, the buffalo. In the early 1600s, Chippewa and Cree nations pressured Assiniboine peoples to establish a trade with the French and British. The latter refers to the fur trade. It consisted of a vast commercial enterprise across Canada, which was crucial to satisfy European demands. In the early 17th century, the fur trade was important because it mattered for the Nakotas to maintain a good relation with the French and British, since they would receive metal and cloth goods in exchange. Assiniboine depended on the buffalo for survival. Cree had already acquired weapons such as guns from European traders. The two First Nations, Cree and Assiniboine, intermarried and allied in order to press military against the Dakotas, also known as Sioux. The fur trade lasted nearly 250 years, from early 17th century to the mid-19th century. In the 1630s, Assiniboine first encountered Jesuit missionaries, which were members of a Roman Catholic religious order for men. It was in 1640 that Assiniboine were first acknowledged in the Jesuit relations. Their lands were first referred in the 1657-1658 Jesuit relations, which puts them miles away from west of Lake Nipigon. This was the same region where the French soldier and explorer Daniel Greysolon Dalot first made contact with Assiniboine in 1678. Henry Kelsey, an explorer and a young employee of the Hudson Bay Company, first made direct contact with Assiniboine Nation in the 1690s. His trip is marked as the first time a white man had entered present-day Saskatchewan. In order for Nakotas to receive European goods, such as metal utensils, gunpowder, beads, cloth, liquor, tobacco, and many other manufactured goods, their fur pelts needed to go to the Hudson Bay Company. In the early 1700s to the 1730s, the Sioux Nation acquired stable trading with the French and proceeded by advancing aggressively against the southern Assiniboine and western Cree peoples in the north. As a result of the Dakota war pressures, they moved west for survival. During the 1730s, later explorer Sieur de la Vérendrye, who had commanded fur trade operations in the west, aggressively extended French trading posts west of Lake Superior. By the 1750s, southern Dakotas acquired horses, which were mainly used for the transportation of goods. It was difficult to acquire horses as they were becoming very important to the new southern Assiniboine lifestyle. The 1770s were marked by intertribal conflicts between the Gros Ventre Cree and Assiniboine due to the fact that one nation wanted to control the trade with Europeans. Trade between many First Nations was impacted by competition resulting from the opening of the Hudson-based company trading posts within Saskatchewan. As a result of the good relationship between Assiniboine and European traders, traditional Assiniboine trails became major travel routes to the south. Campsites on the network of rivers that would flow from the Rocky Mountains to Hudson Bay became the main posts for the fur trade and centers for the distribution of goods. In the early 1780s, the Nakotas suffered greatly from smallpox. This epidemic destroyed indigenous populations and resulted in radical changes within tribal relations. The other reason why they moved south was to trade with the Europeans, the Mandan, which provided them with horses, and the Hidatsa. During the first years of the 1800s, the Assiniboine depended heavily on horses and had developed to a plains economy with bison as the central commodity. In 1837, the Nakotas faced the second major smallpox epidemic in the upper Missouri River tribes. But this time, southern Assiniboines did not fully recover. They caught the deadly disease at an American Fur Company trading post, Fort Union, which was established in 1829 in the center of Assiniboine lands on the Missouri River. Assiniboines who were infected fled north, but they could not defeat the disease. The epidemics of smallpox led to the death of 2/3 of southern Assiniboine. The Nakota population went from being 10,000 in the late 18th century to 2,060 by 1890. 2 decades later, Nakota population had increased by only 100 lodges, bringing their population by the mid-1850s to 500 lodges, which was one-half of their pre-epidemic population. The depopulation of southern Assiniboine affected their security, for they faced many enemies. As a result, they were very vulnerable. In 1851, the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ogalalla, Brûlé-Sioux, Croix, Shoshone, Assiniboine, Gros-Ventre, Mandans, Arikaras, and Minnetarees was established. This treaty identified 38 million acres as Crow tribal lands. The latter consists of First Nations who lived in Yellowstone River Valley, which is joined by the Missouri River. There was an estimated 10,000 indigenous peoples who were present. The Fort Laramie Treaty recognized vast territories for the different First Nations and acquired the right to build roads and forts in the indigenous territories. The right to build roads was to aid travel to California because there was a discovery of gold in the state in 1848. The Fort Laramie Treaty was revised in 1852.
The Assiniboine agreed to a tribal boundary on lands in which they did not live but were Assiniboine hunting grounds. These lands extended south of the Missouri River and west of the Yellowstone River. The expansion of colonization saw many eastern nations moving west. This caused a shift in the tribal boundaries as displaced tribes were forced to leave their homelands. In 1969, the Assiniboine were assigned to the Upper Milk River Agency, along with the Gros-Ventre and the River Crows. Lower Assiniboine only came to the agency for supplies or to camp during winter time. In September of that year, a smallpox epidemic struck the Milk River Agency, affecting the Assiniboines and the Gros-Ventre and other Métis. The smallpox epidemic killed many Gros-Ventre, causing the Assiniboine to marry 100 of their women with the Gros-Ventre. A Saskatchewan Assiniboine oral history explains this, where a pipe was captured during a raid on a Gros-Ventre camp. The pipe spirit prophesied the disappearance of the bison and the forthcoming of the smallpox epidemic. Assiniboine and Gros-Ventre leaders reconciled, which is marked by the return of the pipe. By the early 1970s, up to 4,800 Assiniboine were now under the administration of the Milk River Agency. This was in addition to 6,800 Sioux and 4,300 Upper Yanktons. The crowding of the First Nations under this treaty led to the nations hunting the now rapidly disappearing bison. However, in 1879, General Sheridan reported that white commercial hunters had killed thousands of bison. This caused a rapid disappearance along the southern side of the Missouri River. These areas are primarily Assiniboine hunting grounds, as agreed upon by the 1851 Treaty of Laramie. Many Assiniboine reported the widespread killing of bison, with 3 colonial hunters killing an entire herd of 150 bison. In 1882, the remaining bison moved south of the Missouri River, entirely exterminated from Assiniboine territorial lands, decimating the Assiniboine economy and their access to food. The disappearance of the bison, compounded by limiting food provisions, caused widespread starvation at the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. In the following year, Henry Teller, Secretary of the Interior, and Hiram Price established laws governing the Court of Indian Offenses. These rules criminalized practice and expression of indigenous spirituality, with cultural traditions and religious ceremonies condemned with fines and jail time. Indigenous practices such as ethnobotany and forms of traditional medicine were specifically targeted by these laws. The combination of limited food and medical provisioning, failing crops, and severe winters caused many Assiniboine of the Wolf Point sub-agency to die of starvation by 1886. Under the administration of the Indian agent Samuel Snyder, Wolf Creek Assiniboine were prevented from leaving the agency. Snyder also refused them to sell or kill their horses for food, causing reservation-wide suffering due to starvation. In 1889, beef rations were cut in half, and a congressional act was implemented to reduce the Fort Peck Reservation to its current size. In the mid-1890s, the Fort Peck Residential Boarding School was established by missions. This was done for the purpose of providing against the further decline and final extinction of the Indian tribes, and for introducing among them the habits and arts of civilization, to instruct them in the mode of agriculture suited to their situation, and for teaching the children reading, writing, and arithmetic. This is in the words of the U.S. statutes at large. In the 1890s, many children of very young ages were removed from their families and taken to the Fort Peck Residential School. Along with educational instruction, the boarding school provided student labor as boys primarily worked in fields, with girls tending towards sewing. The lack of adequate congressional funding meant boarding schools had to grow their own crops through student labor to feed themselves. Many schools incorporate religious instruction in order to Christianize students at the schools. The ultimate goal of this was assimilation, as successive generations of young children lost their cultural and family ties with their indigenous heritage. Some children never returned home to their families, and those that died at the boarding school were buried in cemeteries at the school. In 1948, assimilation was the dominant goal of the public policy. A task force of Indian Affairs reported that the historical Indian way of life was gone, and traditional tribal organization had been replaced for at least a generation. Only a handful of reservation populations, meaning full-blooded Assiniboine, could be considered real Indians, but that did not even total 0.3% of the population. By 1953, civil rights were extended to all minorities, including Indians, therefore assimilating into the mainstream populations of Canada and the United States, and consequently resulting in the ethno-genocide of the Assiniboine First Nation. As long as the rich Assiniboine heritage and history remains recognized in modern-day North America, the Assiniboine Nation will continue to persist through time.